You're listening to Health Innovators, a podcast and video show about the leaders, influencers, and early adopters who are shaping the future of healthcare. I'm your host, Dr. Roxy Mooney. Health Innovators, welcome back to today's episode. I'm sitting down with Elizabeth Ruzzo, who is the founder and CEO of Aiden. Welcome to the show, Elizabeth.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk to you.
It is great to have you here today. So let's start off by sharing a little bit about your background and what you're innovating these days.
Sure. So my background is in genetics. I have a PhD in human genetics and genomics, and I spent many years looking for genetic causes of diseases. I spent a lot of time looking at both epilepsy and autism. And a lot of what I realized in the course of that decade plus of research was that there were a couple of health inequities that I kept experiencing. So the first was that anytime I went to do a genetic study in a non-European population, I had less statistical power to make the same kind of discoveries as I could in a European population.
So explain that a little bit.
Sure. So basically, genetics in the early days did a lot of sequencing of European individuals, which meant that all of your healthy controls that you would compare a disease population to would also be European. So if you wanted to do that in a non-European population and look for, in our case, we were looking for a lot of rare variants. If you didn't see it in the controls, you didn't know if it was truly rare or if it only looked rare because we hadn't looked at enough well-matched samples.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And the second health inequity that we kept seeing was this medical research gender gap. So this became especially apparent when I was doing work in autism, which has 4 times as many males as females that get diagnosed with autism. And so we were working on understanding the biological basis of that. And it became clear that there were just far less research studies done to understand women's biology, and women were intentionally excluded from clinical trials for many years and not actually required to be included in them until 1993.
Okay, wait, what?
Yep, it's crazy.
Why aren't more people even talking about this? I mean, I've never heard this before.
It's a pretty outrageous statistic.
Yeah.
And I think that people are also, other people and companies and institutions are working on it, but it's shocking. And so we even had this problem, not just in humans, but even down to animal studies. Animal studies were focused on only, male mice, for example, because it was thought that there was a lot more variability in females, including because of their hormone fluctuations, which is part of what I'm now interested in studying. Right. And turns out hormone fluctuations happen in and out of a controlled study. So you want to actually understand that variability and use it to your advantage to understand what's actually going to happen when you bring something to market, especially in the case of drug development.
So when you said intentional, it wasn't necessarily intentional to be biased or sexist in the medical research. It was just more of ruling out some maybe the additional complexities or variables within the study. So kind of simplifying the data or the study.
Exactly. It makes your life easier to have a really homogeneous sample set. Mm-hmm. This happens a lot with clinical trials too. They'll have a very long list of requirements for what it takes to be eligible for that clinical trial. Yep. And it turns out later when you go and look at those data that in fact you can maybe have helped a whole lot of a broader subset of people, a more heterogeneous population, but it just was easier to start with that homogeneous set.
Yeah, which I do see that very often, why that real world evidence post-marketing surveillance is so critical, because it's more of a regular population instead of whatever was for that sample in that particular clinical trial. Okay.
Exactly.
All right. So 1993. So what happened then?
So then they created requirements in the US that required that women were included in every clinical study. And so we have slowly been getting better and better at this. But what Aiden, so now you asked what my innovation was. I founded a company called Aiden. And our mission is to make scientific discovery more inclusive. And so in order to do that, we're starting with working on things that were previously ignored, primarily working on helping individuals in need of birth control find the right birth control for their biology. So we've created the first test that's designed to prevent birth control side effects.
And why is that an important issue?
So there are, well, maybe I'll have you guess. Do you want to guess how many birth control options are available in the US?
Well, my husband had a vasectomy, so that was my route.
Lucky.
Luckily. So I have not stayed tuned in to the world of birth control, but I imagine there are quite a few.
Yeah. So there are nearly 200 options available in the US.
I would never guessed that.
Yeah. And, women use birth control for 30 years on average in the US. And the other important thing to remember is that birth control is not just used for preventing pregnancy. It's also used as medicine to treat a number of reproductive disorders, or at least manage their symptoms for things like endometriosis and PCOS. Mm-hmm. So the problem right now is that doctors have no way to predict ahead of time which patient is going to experience which side effect, which is why the majority of women have to try 4 or more methods to find one that works for them.
Okay. So then where are you in the innovation process now?
So we are currently running our pilot study, and we are basically starting with 2 of the most dangerous side effects. So risk for depression and risk for blood clots. Mm-hmm. And so the way I can describe a little bit about how we've developed the product. So it's a at-home test kit that's ordered by our doctors that then gets sent to your home. You take a saliva sample for us to analyze DNA and a small finger spot of blood for us to analyze hormone levels. And then we generate a report that includes your readouts from both your genetic risk and your hormone levels. And then we also provide a way for you to understand the pros and cons of all the available birth control options that are out there. And we provide a telemedicine visit with providers that we've trained specifically to not only understand the biological readouts we're giving, but also help you understand how that fits in with your own reproductive goals and priorities, right? So the other really interesting thing about birth control is there's preference involved. Some people hate having to remember to take a pill at the same time every day. Some people hate the idea of having something permanently implanted. Right. So our providers are really focused on making sure that the patient feels empowered with now having all of the information at their disposal that they have to make the best possible decision and hopefully avoid that long, arduous process of trial and error.
So I think, there's never a only one commercialization path for any organization. So kind of just take us back to maybe some of the earlier days, depending on whether that was 60 days ago or 6 years ago, when you were determining, which path you were going to take, who was going to be your target audience, and what was going to be that business model around your commercialization strategy.
Yeah. So I went back and forth, to be honest, about if this was best to try to start in a clinical setting or direct to consumer. Mm-hmm. But what I realized was that it was ideal to kind of have the best of both worlds. So we're having physicians involved in the process from the beginning. Mm-hmm. So that they can, which is why we built in that telemedicine visit, so that we can have the medical community see that what we're doing is scientifically robust and accurate, and that it will actually make their lives easier. The average contraceptive counseling appointment is 13 minutes in the US. So they don't have the amount of time or the amount of information that we are going to provide for them making that decision.
Wow.
So we're starting direct to consumer, also in part because you can get the prescriptions by mail order right now, and a lot of people are doing that. There's also a push in the US in a number of states. I believe it's already 13 states where you can get birth control over the counter from your pharmacist. And so to imagine, birth control is kind of in flux where people need it. They might need to be able to get it discreetly. They might not have the resources to be able to go out of their way to visit a doctor. And so we're really thinking about accessibility, and also thinking longer term about how do we partner with those doctors and clinics to help make their job of prescribing the best we can.
So essentially the entire experience is being triggered by the consumer instead of by the physician in the normal or traditional healthcare model.
Correct. Yep.
Okay. And so the consumer is triggering that. And then, of course, in states where whether they can get it over the counter or whether it's prescription based, they're still going. The next step is, you've built awareness and demand with a consumer. They raise their hand, they say yes, and then they go to the telehealth visit, they get the test.
They order the test. Okay. Technically, it's ordered. On the back end, we basically collect enough information that the doctor needs to agree that they are a good candidate for getting this test. So that's all kind of behind the scenes ordered for them. And then the test results also get approved by that clinician before the customer sees it again. So then after the customer sees their results, they have the option to schedule that telemedicine visit and go through the test results and make that contraceptive counseling appointment.
So who's paying for it?
The telemedicine visit?
Well, the test and the telemedicine, right?
Yeah.
So a lot of times when we're talking about direct to consumer, we're talking about cash pay.
Yeah.
And this seems to be somewhat of a unique model, possibly.
So right now we're starting as cash pay, but as I mentioned earlier, we're really focused on accessibility. So what I think is unique about Aiden as compared to a lot of tests that are out there is that it is providing medically actionable results. And so our hope is that because you're actually making an impact that helps have economic outcome that's favorable for the insurance companies, which is what really matters to get coverage, that they would be interested in covering this test for their customers. So that is definitely what we are working towards.
I think it's innovative. I think it's an innovative business model. And I think that the timing is, well, I guess your data will tell us, right? In the near future. But I think the timing is really ripe for consumer first healthcare, where, as consumers, we're making different choices than the healthcare system would make for us, and more choice, more empowerment. And frankly, willing to put some money out of pocket to be able to express that choice. I think we're seeing more and more of that happen.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's more important than ever that people can make informed and personalized choices about their sexual and reproductive health. And I think that one benefit of this nightmare that we've been in, which is COVID, is the availability and comfort that people have adopted with telemedicine and with at-home testing, right? People are giving themselves COVID tests at home or getting them quite frequently. And so I think people see that is freedom, right? To be able to understand what's happening. And we're hoping to do the same thing with birth control.
I've ordered blood tests online.
Have you? Yeah. And how was your experience?
Excellent.
Good.
It was so quick, so convenient. And I got the panel that I wanted instead of the panel that that came with my insurance.
Yep.
And then I've done the hormone testing online, and I've done the allergy testing. Now, I will say, actually not the allergy testing. It wasn't what you're allergic to, but it was what works with your DNA.
Oh, cool.
different way to describe it. Anyway, and I identified all of these things that I shouldn't eat. And I was like, yeah, I'm not giving that up. So so the whole test model worked, but then I was like, yeah, no.
Right. I mean, it's interesting how sometimes knowledge of that information still doesn't change behavior. Now, if they had told you that, you had a super high risk of breast cancer and there were more frequent screenings you could do or things like that, you might have been more motivated to do that than,
Absolutely.
give up chocolate cake.
Up almonds. It was almonds. And I was like, I'm not
that is such a staple.
yeah, exactly. So as you were kind of wrestling with this idea, when you were saying that you went back and forth, what were some of those things where you were looking at the pros and cons? We kind of touched on some of them, but, is there anything else that would be valuable to our audience on some of the pros and cons that you weighed as you were looking at the different commercialization paths you could take?
I think there were two that really pushed me over the edge. So when I thought about what it would look like to do it in existing health systems, it required that you were confident doctors had written down birth control side effects, which, as someone who was gaslit by my medical professional and told that I was not having birth control side effects when I was, there's a very low likelihood that that's captured. And it's definitely unlikely to be captured as structured data, meaning it might be written in notes. Yeah. But that becomes a natural language processing, data mining nightmare.
Yeah.
So that was definitely in the cons category. And in the pros category, or con for going in the B2B route, and pro for the direct to consumer route is also that ability to consent them to participate in research and to be able to recontact them. So what I mean by that is, with our mission of making scientific discovery more inclusive, we're hoping that people will understand the importance of that larger mission, that they will recognize that we are trying to make up for decades of people not studying diseases that primarily affect or majority affect women and girls. And so by opting in, you can help us by letting us do things like reach back out and say, hey, have you ever experienced uterine fibroids? Have you ever experienced this other thing? And really be able to help make discoveries that we will then publish for the larger medical community, for everyone to benefit from.
Yeah. Yep. Okay. That makes sense. Hey, it's Dr. Roxy here with a quick break from the conversation. Are you trying to figure out what moves you need to make to survive and thrive in the new COVID economy? I want every health innovator to find their most viable and profitable pivot strategy, which is why I created the COVID Proof Your Business Pivot Kit. The Pivot Kit is a step-by-step framework that helps you find your best pivot strategy. It walks you through 6 categories you need to examine for a 360-degree view of your business. I call them the 6 critical pivot lenses. As you make your way through this comprehensive kit, you'll be armed with the tools, tips, and strategies you need to make sure you can pivot with speed without missing out on critical details and opportunities. Learn more at legacy-dna.com/kit. So, kind of thinking about this, gender gap, one of the topics that often comes up when it's not always the case, but one of the topics that often comes up when I have female guests on the show is, what is it like to be an innovator in healthcare as a female entrepreneur and we're making progress, but on a highly dominated, male dominated environment, especially. And the reason why I want to talk about this even more so with you is especially when you're talking about a highly female based company like you have.
Yeah. I mean, I think the times it is most obvious has been when I was talking to investors. So if I was talking to male investors who are still the majority of investors in the US, I would basically see that if they understood the problem, they were likely interested to continue the conversation. But if they didn't understand the problem, it was such a barrier because they didn't have a partner, a sister, daughter who had experienced this. And so even though I had stats, even though, they didn't believe it, or they didn't see the need to fix it, or they thought, oh, but, their doctor can already do that. That's what doctors do.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So I think that has been one of the biggest challenges.
Okay. And I think there's some part of that that's just inherent, right? Like where, investors aren't going to be passionate about solving everyone's, problem. There's usually some kind of missional purpose behind those investments that are being made. And then I think you kind of circumventing the traditional healthcare system certainly eliminates some of those gender encounters that you would have to deal with traditionally in bringing an innovation to market, being able to go directly to consumers.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so let's talk about your go-to-market strategy. Where are you now in that process? And then what are some of the strategies that you're deploying that you've had success with? And what are some of the things that have been challenges or barriers for you?
Yeah. So right now we are have launched our pilot. So we're going through the full experience with these individuals from filling out their medical history and getting the test, all the way through to generating the report, having it signed off on by the physician, and then scheduling those telemedicine visits, and all the way through to potentially getting a mail order subscription if the patient chooses to do that. Mm-hmm. And so meanwhile, we have been in a early access stage. So on our website, we launched a way for people to come, tell us a little bit about who they are and sign up. And then we also included a rewards program in that. So a referral rewards program. So if you tell 1, 3, or 5 of your friends, you can you get different rewards at those levels. And part of what we're hoping to do with that is really also make it an easy way to start a conversation about side effects, which is, something that is sometimes still stigmatized, side effects around birth control. So
talking about like a new hair product that I have at a party is completely different than talking about my birth control side effects, right?
Exactly. So we've had some success with that already. And we've been just now really starting to think about our digital strategy on different channels where our customers are. And I think one of the biggest challenges, since you asked, is just thinking about how do we market a product that applies to 3 decades of individuals. So that is a challenge that
you want to apply your same business model to your marketing strategy, recognizing that you don't want to do trial and error healthcare, but you also don't want to do trial and error marketing to your target audience. Because they're all different too.
Yep, exactly. And they're at different life stages, right? So it comes from people who have never been on birth control before, but 7 in 10 teens use birth control to manage symptoms of PMS. So it's important to understand where everyone is finding you, or it's somebody who's, in their mid to late 20s and has had a bunch of bad experiences with side effects, a lot of trial and error, and is sick of it. Or maybe it's someone postpartum who's just had a baby and wants to not have another one right away and think about what that option looks like and reevaluate, or, all the way through to someone starting to go through perimenopause. So how do we talk to them? How do we communicate what we're doing in a way that resonates with those somewhat disparate needs?
Yeah. So, it sounds like you guys are taking your targeting strategy to another level, which I think is really important when you're talking about direct to consumer. You've identified a gender, you've identified an age range, but recognizing that, like we said, not everybody in that gender, in that age range is going to be this homogeneous group. They're all going to be experiencing problems or use cases in a different way. So what are some of the things, and maybe you're still figuring that out, but what are some of the things that you're putting in place? Because you're not going to be the only one out there that's trying to figure out this like audience message mapping, if you will,
Yeah.
on a really broad scale of
Yeah.
how are you going to identify um, those different cases, use cases, as well as being able to match your marketing to that specific audience and that specific situational triggers, if you will.
Data. Lots of data is the goal. So anything from thinking about surveys to, paid ad experiments, to also just recognizing what's already in the data about demographic people on different channels, TikTok versus Facebook age ranges are very different.
Yeah.
Things like that. So trying to focus on what we can to understand those different groups, and also get in more traditional media outlets that might have like a user group that would resonate. I have a suspicion that, we want people who believe in science, who understand, or maybe they don't care what we're doing, but they trust that we know what we're doing. I think that that's going to be likely to get faster adoption.
Yeah. And definitely influencer marketing,
Yeah.
because they will know their tribe. They will probably be able to help you identify those use cases within their tribe, and being able to cultivate those messages and match that.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that's a good point. I think we're trying to start thinking about how we can leverage influencers, not just to reach those audiences, but also let those influencers do the messaging they think they've found in a way that would resonate, kind of partnering with them to do that. Not saying, oh, here's this script, here's this, we want you to do exactly this, because I don't think that's not making the best use of their knowledge about their own audience.
Well, and certainly, you've kind of got the movement energy, the cause behind this. So you won't find it too difficult to find a group of social media influencers or just participants that want to rally the cause of the disparities in medical research around gender.
Yep. And we need more people to be shouting about it from the rooftop. So I hope you're right about that.
In order for that to change faster. Yeah. I mean, you can probably come up with like a dream 100 list of influencers that have some really big voices and big influence around these specific topics.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're right on about that. Would that be your primary go-to would be influencers, or do you have any other secret tricks when you think about that broad of an audience?
I definitely think the influencers.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's the and it also depends. Okay, so when you're going to direct to consumer, obviously it's going to be a lot more expensive than doing B2B, right? So there's some kind of grassroots approaches that you can take. And so, those people with 15 million followers are going to be priced very differently than someone that has, let's say 1 million. And so it's not necessarily always the best approach, especially for an early stage company, to try to get those, most prominent influencers.
Yeah.
So having second tier or even third tier influencers can be the right approach. They don't, and then it could be, there's a number of different factors, brand alignment, is your brand bold and, and like what's the attitude and personality of your brand, and then making sure that you're finding influencers that share that common attitude and personality. I think that's really important. So if you're going to be like this science-based type of brand, that's going to be very different than if you're out there and you're rallying around gender issues. You would do that. You could do that same thing in two completely different ways. So I think that brand alignment is going to be really important. And I'm a huge advocate. If anyone's listened to this show, you probably are like, I know what she's going to say. She's going to say co-creation, because she says that on every episode. But co-creation, is co-creating with the influencers and bringing them into the conversation, putting some tools in place to be able to co-create what this launch. So a lot of times when we're thinking about involving customers in the process, we're usually thinking about design thinking or human-centered design. We
Yep.
design something and we go like, hey, look at this. Tell me what you think. We really, as a whole in the industry, miss out on co-creating the launch. And, we might hire marketing agencies or teams, internal or external, and come up with this, marketing plan of channels and messages and audiences and whatnot. And most often we do those very siloed
Yeah.
without including the target customers. And I go, okay, let's stop that right now. And every company should be co-creating
Yeah.
with those target customers. It will save you lots of headaches, lots of money, and also, help you with your window of opportunity. Because, when you don't, you're kind of guessing along the way, guessing wrong. You might run out of money, and you might have actually then, took you 2 years to figure out what that formula was going to be, what was that conversion path going to be. And now, there's 5 more competitors in the space than when you first started.
Yep. Yep. Absolutely. No, I think that's spot on.
And of course, influencers, that's in their DNA, whether they use that word co-creation or not, like that's what they're passionate about doing. So there's a bunch of tools and things that you can do to kind of bring them in and remove the guesswork and help formulate your entire go-to-market strategy. Yeah.
Thanks. I think that's really smart.
You're welcome. So, as you kind of just think about where you are now, are there any other lessons learned or any other tips to be aware of or things for people to watch out, pitfalls to watch out for as they're either making that decision between B2B and B2C, or if they choose the B2C route, is there anything that you've already learned of like, stay away from this or do this?
That's a very good question. I don't know if I have any real stay away from or do this, but I will say, I think part of what made it feel less scary to go the direct to consumer route was like, well, I'm a consumer. So I understand like somewhat inherently what that might look like or how I might figure out messaging. And I know that it would involve social and these kinds of things, but there's so many things. There's so much more to it than that. Like I never thought I would be thinking about key terms and SEO and, so it's been fun. I like all that stuff, but I think it's just being aware of how those are going to look super different. And I think on the B2B side, you just have a different set of problems with then maybe you need a sales team and a sales strategy. And so I think I guess my advice would be like, don't over agonize the route. If you think you need to figure out what the product needs, what makes more sense to make it a reality.
Yeah. Yeah. And you're spot on. The marketing piece can be so complicated. If you ask someone, what do you do? Oh, well, I'm in marketing. Well, that could mean like 1,000 different things, right? There's so many different domains of expertise. There's so many different channels. I mean, it's just the world of marketing. And let's just say that it's also dynamic, right? So if you're like, oh, social media, okay, well, what of the 20 channels are you talking about? Oh, and next month there's a new one. Oh, and then the algorithms change.
Exactly.
So it is a huge undertaking. And so, you just partner with experts in those different areas. Maybe sometimes you have a blend of generalists that know a little bit about different things, but then at some point being able to make the investment in those specialists around specific things. The other thing that I would just say what you're talking about is I think sometimes when people are going direct to consumer, it can be, it's really easy to get caught up in how would I say this? Like shiny marketing syndrome in the sense of like, TikTok's really hot right now. So I need to be on TikTok and my gosh, I got to be on YouTube and oh my gosh, I got to be on Insta and all of these different things. And then all of a sudden, you had $50,000 a month to work with, but now you've spread yourself out so thin that none of it's really effective. And you're like, oh, maybe this direct to consumer path isn't going to work. Well, actually it could work. So starting off with a couple of channels and making those very successful and having some restraint with the temptation when someone goes, oh, you definitely need to be on whatever that is.
Yeah. And taking the time to like analyze your own learnings from whatever you did try to understand what might be working and what's not before you go throw a bunch of money at a new channel thinking that's going to be some kind of magic. If you never like figured out a message that resonates, doesn't matter where you're going.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it could be that you think, I mean, I see this all the time with clients, thinking that the channel doesn't work for me. And it's really not the channel, it's more of the ads or it's more of the message, exactly what you're talking about. So getting that alignment between the audience, the message and the channel, or the offer is always, that's the fun part, right? It's that experimentation.
Yeah, I think so. I'm like, oh, another data problem. I can do that.
Exactly. Oh, well, Elizabeth, this has been so wonderful. Thank you so much for joining me. If there's anyone in the audience that would like to get a hold of you to learn more about Aiden or just connect with you about your founder's journey, how would they get in touch with you?
Yeah, you can email us at hello@adyn.com, and myself or someone else will get back to you. Someone else is better at poking my calendar than reaching out to my inbox directly.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Roxy.
Thank you so much for listening. I know you're busy working to bring your life-changing innovation to market, and I value your time and attention. To get the latest episodes on your mobile device automatically, subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast app like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Stitcher. Thank you for listening, and I appreciate everyone who shared the show with friends and colleagues. See you on the next episode of Health Innovators.